I'm Dr. Iain Britton, an academic who studies volunteers and policing internationally, and I'm delighted to continue our series of interviews on Policing TV with experts and leaders around the world of volunteer policing by being joined today by Andrew Morley. So a huge welcome to Policing TV, Andrew. Would you first like to introduce yourself and share with us some of your history of involvement with policing in your current role?
Well, good morning, Ian, and good morning, Policing TV, from a very sunny Abu Dhabi, which you can probably see in the background of my screen. So I've now been involved in policing and public safety for 30 years, though I have to say it doesn't feel anywhere near that much. So I currently work for PwC Middle East, where I focus exclusively on projects related to policing and public safety. But prior to that, I spent 20 plus years in the policing ecosystem back home in the UK, and I did a whole range of stuff. So I did criminal justice policy around the Persistent Young Offenders Pledge, if you remember that. I had policy responsibility for issues like stop and search. And then latterly, I was seconded to the Metropolitan Police Service to lead on criminal justice, where, working with the criminal justice agencies in London, we sort of designed and delivered a fairly fundamental criminal justice reform programme. So, policing for a long time. I've also been a volunteer in policing because my journey into policing started as a volunteer. I was a chair of a lay visiting panel in Lewisham, which is in South London. Lay visitors were volunteers that visited custody suites to check on the conditions and the rights of people that were detained by the police. And that really was the start of my journey. So the whole volunteering piece has a certain resonance with me.
Thank you. And you've undertaken some work more recently focused on volunteers and policing. Would you like to share that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's important to start by saying that, the concept of volunteering is very much embedded within the region. So I started by saying I work for PwC Middle East. We cover the GCC plus a couple of other countries, and many countries have national development programs in which volunteering is heavily represented. So as an example, Saudi Arabia, their Vision 2030 program, which is their sort of North Star in terms of the development of the nation, the diversification from the oil industry. Within that, they have a target to have 1 million volunteers. Now, actually, that was the target was by 2030, and actually it was achieved, I think, in 2024. So strategically, a real focus on volunteering for all the reasons that you would expect in terms of inclusivity, social cohesion, well-being of individuals. So making sure that society is one that is participatory is recognised in those national agendas. Within that, police services and broader public safety agencies, I think, have been recognising that they need and want to play their part. They do see the advantages and benefits of volunteers. And recently, some work that we did is we worked with a regional police service in reviewing and developing their volunteering arrangements. Now, the arrangements were very good, to be fair. I think they just needed some help in terms of codifying those, understanding how they might be better articulated in terms of how they're fitted with their broader policing strategy. And so that was a piece of work we did a couple of years back, which of course, Ian, you were very helpful with as well. And we consider it to be a really good piece of work, and it allowed us to crystallise our thinking about the very important role that volunteers can play in supporting public safety for reasons I'm sure we will come on to.
You've also led on bringing together a strategic policy paper on future directions for volunteer policing. Can you share with us some of the key messages from that report?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, look, I think you're being a little bit too modest, Ian, because of course you co-authored this report with me, though very much a PwC Middle East, University of Northampton jointly published piece. And effectively what we were trying to do was pull together in one place a sort of route map, the case for and a route map for the engagement of volunteers in policing. So the paper does a couple of things really. Number one, it makes the case for policing, both in terms of policing in the broadest terms around capacity and capability. It makes the case in terms of individuals, in terms of the well-being dividend, and also the contribution it makes in terms of professional development, the skills that they gather. A lot of evidence around that. And then the sort of the public safety gains in terms of enhancing the sort of public safety ecosystem, but also in terms of social inclusions for those countries which are particularly diverse, which of course is very important here in the Middle East, where we have hugely diverse communities, the opportunity for policing, who have very strict nationality rules, to engage volunteers, to engage with other parts of the community is very, very powerful. And I think the other thing that we try to make the point of, or try to make the case for, is that we shouldn't just be seeing this as a nice to have volunteers. Is actually there is now very strong evidence about the benefits that volunteers bring across all of those domains that I mentioned. And I think one that we talk about often, which certainly gets some traction, is the experience in Japan, where in Tokyo there was a bit of a crime wave. There was a very imaginative, actually, crime prevention strategy, and it wasn't just about volunteers. There was another element which was around encouraging people to beautify their front yards, grow flowers, which I think is hugely imaginative and showed great benefits. But actually, as part of that, they engaged, I think, 5,000 volunteers to basically go out on patrol at various times of the day, connected with the police via a radio. And that contributed to a very significant, over 50% reduction in crime and significant increases in terms of confidence. So part of what the paper does is it makes the case, which moves it from volunteers are nice to volunteers can play a very significant role in the policing and public safety mission. We also then effectively set out a framework which we called REAP, as in reaping the benefits. And there are 4 elements to that. One is around the rationale. This is where we make the case to say, look, it's important that you think about volunteers as part of your strategic capability, that you don't just think of this as something that's nice to have, that you go and do a ceremony for, that this is an important part of your toolbox that you can deploy in certain circumstances to deal with very specific issues. There's then the experience bit, which is about making sure that the volunteer's experience is all that it might be. So, the timeliness in terms of when people express a desire to become a volunteer, the timeliness of the process, the personalisation of that. Now, I think that's a good thing in itself, but I also think that there are benefits in terms of confidence and trust in policing. We know from the whole procedural justice stuff that engagement with policing in itself is very powerful in inspiring trust and confidence. So the way in which we engage with volunteers has an extra dividend in terms of making people feel that the policing is, an important agency with whom they have trust, which has benefits in terms of their broader law enforcement mission. We then talk about the arrangements, making sure that you're tracking contributions. The contributions are properly allocated to the issues that those skills are best played into. That there is a central point of contact within the agency. Someone's responsible for managing this effort. And then we talk about performance, which goes back to the strategy bit, having very clear metrics so you can measure and articulate the value of that volunteering performance moving forward. So effectively that's what we do. We make the case in terms of drawing on the evidence as to why it works, what are the benefits, but then set out a very practical framework which we hope that police services can use to develop and design their own arrangements.
You've mentioned some of this, but in the region, what models of volunteer police currently exist in different agencies and countries? How do you see those perhaps developing and evolving in the future?
Yeah, so we have some very well-established volunteering experiences. I think probably in the UAE, from where I'm talking to you, are the most evolved arrangements. So, one of our police services, I think almost all our police services use volunteers to a greater or lesser extent, but I think the programme that I would highlight, and one that we highlight in the paper, is the Abu Dhabi We Are Police programme, which I think is just fantastic. I mean, it's been in operation since 2016, and effectively these are volunteers who have very limited police powers. It's primarily around reporting offences. They wear tabards, so they are distinctive and distinguishable in terms of being police volunteers, used across a range of stuff, primarily around capacity. So it's about crowd control at big events. Potentially, you see them in the malls at very busy periods around some of that. But they now have something like 14,000 volunteers. I think 70,000 nationalities. And again, it goes back to my earlier comment. I mean, the UAE, as many of your viewers will know, we are heavily a majority migrant population. With many communities. So the opportunity for those volunteers to come from those, I think 70 nationalities are represented. So almost every, I'm sure, nationality that comes to the UAE has a way in to that. So I think it's a fantastic scheme. In terms of how it may evolve and develop, I think And I think it comes on probably something we will speak about, in a little while, is around the specialist volunteer piece. It's about recognising that actually there are skill gaps in policing, and potentially some of those can be met in part through volunteers. So it'd be good to see. We may very well see that happen. But I think in terms of ensuring that, that there is a visible, recognisable public safety ecosystem, recognising that all of our communities need to be part of that public safety mission. The We Are Police programme is a fantastic example, and I think one that could teach many jurisdictions a lot from it.
I know you just mentioned the specialist volunteering, people who bring professional skill sets from outside of policing, such as technical, digital cyber skill sets around economic and financial crime, and actually potentially a wide range of other things. Can you just sort of tell us a little bit about that and the potential that you think it has?
Well, look, I think this is the big next development, or the big next thing in terms of volunteers. I think typically around policing. I think in the main, volunteers, if you look globally, and I generalise up to a point, but volunteers have been seen in terms of capacity. So it's about bringing in numbers at key times to help. That doesn't mean there aren't specialisms within it. I know there's some stuff around search and rescue, for example, where there are. But again, it is about enhancing capacity, potentially with some capability stuff here. I think what we are, if we look at cybercrime as an example, we anticipate that cybercrime is going to be costing, I think, $14 trillion by 2028, or certainly by the end of the decade. I mean, this is big stuff, and it's been the big shift that we've seen in policing, going from, in-person street crime to online. And, we know that policing has a skill gap. I think a latest survey, 75% of law enforcement agencies reported that they were not confident they had the right skills in place to meet with this shift of crime from the in-person to online space. And yet we have, a hugely skillful cohort of people, particularly young people, who are highly trained, highly experienced, highly skilled. And I think it also takes us back to some of the principle around policing, the Peelian principle about we are the police and where policing started. Interestingly, even here in the region, policing started through volunteering. So the concept was al-Asas, where basically, very much like in the UK, members of the community would volunteer to patrol their community at night, to enforce curfews primarily, and to ensure that there was no theft. So policing started in volunteering. And actually, I think this is an opportunity where that volunteering can come back. Now, I know there is experience. We know that there's some experience in the UK and in the Netherlands. I think they are the two countries where there are structured schemes. But it seems to me that you have a skill set. You have people who are people who have the skills. And I think, we read a lot about, lack of deference and interest and involvement in policing. My sense of working with, I'm in a young industry in consulting. I'm very old compared to the people that I work with. There is a genuine sense of altruism. They do want to give back. And I think that if we could structure programs to bring in those skills and experience, it could actually be something that could help, not just in terms of the fight against crime, but that broader stuff, which is about, the police are the public are the police. And that's important because it demystifies policing. It means in a world where we know trust is an issue globally, members of the public have a much better sense of the real challenges of policing, and then are able to make more intelligent assessments of when things happen, about what it is reasonable to expect and what it's not reasonable to expect. So I think there's a huge dividend in terms of skill, trust, and also for the individuals in terms of applying their skills in a different environment from the one they come from, and therefore refining, honing them. I also think that in a world where the technology companies are becoming, very significant, there's a very strong case for corporate social responsibility around some of this. We know that the technology companies take a lot of criticism around cybercrime, some of it with merit, some of it just because they're part of that industry where the crime is happening. This would be a really good opportunity for them to demonstrate their commitment to crime fighting in terms of crime, cybercrime. But also it would allow them to build skills and knowledge and experience within their organisation, which may make it easier for them to play their role in keeping the internet safe.
One of the challenges, I think, is enabling senior police leaders to appreciate this potential value of volunteers. That's not a criticism of police leadership, it's more an acknowledgement of just how busy police leaders are with many other competing challenges and priorities. How do you think we can better involve senior leaders in this agenda, in this debate around volunteer contribution in the future?
So look, I think that's in part what our paper was about. The report that we published was absolutely about making the case and showing the quantifiable benefits. And there's a lot of evidence out there, in those small parts of the work, Iain, that you and colleagues have done around the research base, that actually provides that compelling case to involve. And I think there is a bit of a burning platform. So we have an issue in terms of many police services, if we take a global perspective, many police services are now in an environment of budget cuts. So, finances are tough. They absolutely have to justify, quite rightly, every pound, dollar that they are spending. So there's a bit about financial budgetary pressures. There is something around trust. It goes back to that point as well, about the fact that, public trust is under real pressure and threat, and therefore, volunteers can help with that. And then you've got this skill gap. You've got this whole new crime environment, which is proving very, very challenging and is having significant impact in terms of the citizen experience of crime. Given if we're able to better quantify the case and the evidence to support volunteers as part of that, then I think senior policing leaders will start to realise that they are a solution. And again, I've said it again, but not just a group of people that they're supportive of, because I do get the sense, in my time of policing, people are always supportive of people like the Special Constabulary. But I think there's a bit about absolutely linking it into the strategic capability, i.e. this is a capability I have, how can I use it? And outside of individual operations, because there are examples where that works well. So if I go back, to my experience in London, there would be very specific operations, and the Special Constabulary were used to enhance, whatever it was, patrols, reassurance, and all that sort of stuff. I think this is thinking more strategically about how volunteers can be used. So I think it's making the case along those three benefits. I think the other thing that we need to be better at, and I know Iain, you and I have spoken about this before, is that we need to come up with a sort of consistent measurement framework, if you like. So I think we need to come up with some metrics, and I know that we've spoken previously about the idea of some sort of index around volunteers, which I think would be really helpful for us to quantify the impact and then start to develop the evidence base. And in doing that, to identify where they work well and when they don't work well. Because I think one of the challenges with a capability that's seen as important and valued, and I think it is, but not seen as part of the strategic core, it doesn't have the same discipline in terms of performance management metrics as other parts of the operation do. And what's entirely true is some of the stuff that we are thinking about now may not work. It may not be appropriate for volunteers, but until such time as we test it and we evidence it, we're not in a position to push that debate forward. So I think it's about making the case, drawing on the evidence base to say, look, these are the benefits that they can bring, and then putting in place a framework for the measurement of their contribution, which would allow us to make relatively objective decisions about the extent to which where they work and where they don't work.
And you've covered some of this in your last answer, but what's next on this agenda for you?
Well, look, I mean, I'm a consultant, so it's not for me to tell others what to do within the region. But we certainly are here, PwC, to solve important problems. I think, we've identified there is a skill gap, which is not specific to the region, but in terms of policing globally, in terms of that particular, those very specialist skills that policing require. And we do think volunteers potentially could provide a response to that. So we will continue to facilitate discussions and engagement around that. We are talking to a number of policing clients across the region about this as a concept. I think the other thing that we're very keen to do is to support Iain, you and colleagues in terms of trying to get a bit of an international community around this. I know you've done some fantastic work in terms of pulling together volunteer policing services from across the world. We're very keen to make sure that policing services in the region have the opportunity to embed themselves in those structures, not just to learn, but also to provide learning from them. As I said, the We Are Police programme I think is fantastic, and I think there's a lot of learning from that which could be very helpful to a global audience. So we continue to make the case. We think it is a part of a solution, not the whole solution, but part of a solution to an issue which policing is finding is challenging with globally. And I think the other thing around the region, which is why this region is so exciting, frankly. I've described it before in a previous policing TV interview, is that we're a moonshot region. We don't come at this from, what's the least we can do? We come at this right, what is it that we should do? What's the right thing to do? So if we are able to persuade senior colleagues that there is something very valuable in volunteering, as I think you and I believe there is, otherwise we wouldn't be, advocating this agenda. And I think the opportunity for them to really move the dial on the volunteering contribution would be great and significant.
Thank you, Andrew Morley, for some hugely interesting strategic insights across the various opportunities which I think do very much present themselves for volunteers to contribute across policing in the future. And fascinating to hear your thoughts about how that changing policing landscape, the new challenges, particularly in terms of cyber, digital, online criminality, threats, vulnerabilities, point towards volunteers as a potential solution in the future. Volunteers in policing, as you rightly say, exist globally. They have such a potential for the future, and it's not a part of policing that perhaps we often give attention to. So really interesting to hear your insights. And thank you very much for joining us on Policing TV.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it as always.